The patrol car was a mobile coffin of cracked pleather and lukewarm coffee, its climate control perpetually stuck on stifling. Officer Miles Corbin, a man whose face had started collecting lines faster than his savings account, didn't mind the heat. It kept him awake. Tonight, the heat was a dull, oppressive weight over the town of Blackwood Creek, a place so unremarkable it barely registered on GPS. Miles's partner, rookie officer Lena Flores, was fiddling with the dash-mounted tablet. She was fresh out of the academy, all nervous energy and textbook idealism. "Dispatch is quiet tonight, Miles," she said, her voice thin in the static-laced silence, like the whole town went on vacation without telling us. Miles grunted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Blackwood doesn't go on vacation, Flores. It just holds its breath." It was 2:17 a.m. They were cruising down Old Route 80, a ribbon of asphalt that cut through miles of suffocating pine forest. The kind of place where streetlights gave up long ago, swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, the radio crackled, not with the standard voice of the dispatcher, but with a surge of raw, metallic static that made the hairs on Miles's arms stand up. Then a single, distorted burst of sound sliced through. A police siren. But it wasn't their siren, or the county's. This was an antique sound, a chilling, mechanical wail, like an old air raid siren filtered through a broken megaphone. It lasted less than a second, but it felt like an eternity. Flores jumped, slamming her hand on the glove box. What was that? A prank. Miles slowed the car. His heart was doing a frantic drum solo against his ribs. That didn't come from the station, Flores. That signal, it wasn't digitized. He keyed his mic, his voice tight. "Dispatch, this is 7 Adam 12. Did you just run an emergency tone?" The dispatcher's voice, clean and professional, came back instantly. "Negative 7 Adam 12. Radio traffic is clear. Did you hear something, Miles?" "Affirmative. Static spike and an unscheduled alarm sound." "Stand by, checking system logs." Miles pulled over, throwing the cruiser into park. The silence of the forest immediately rushed in, heavy and hostile. "Miles, look at the tablet," Flores whispered, her fingers shaking as she pointed. The tablet, which displayed their patrol map, was behaving erratically. Their location marker, a small blue icon, was now pulsating rapidly. But that wasn't the worst part. An anonymous, unauthorized message had popped up in the corner of the screen. "Code 10 to 66. Officer needs assistance. Location. Classified, signal unreadable." Miles frowned. 10 to 66 hasn't been used since the 60s. The state retired it. And what the hell is signal unreadable? Before Flores could answer, the bizarre siren wailed again, closer this time, and longer. It was a mournful, hungry sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The patrol car's lights flickered, and the engine gave a sickly cough. "Dispatch 7 Adam 12. We have a 10 to 66 on our unit tablet. Did you send this?" Miles demanded. A tense pause from the dispatcher. "Miles, I have nothing. No 10 to 66. No unusual transmissions. I'm seeing a ghost signal on your end, almost like a localized network, but that's impossible." "Localized network," Flores muttered, staring into the dark woods. "Like it's coming from here." The siren shrieked a third time, so loud now it felt like the car speakers were tearing. The radio howled, not with static, but with a multitude of faint, overlapping voices, a chaotic, panic chorus speaking in a language neither officer could understand. Then the siren cut out. The voices vanished. The only thing left was the dispatcher's concerned voice breaking through. "Miles, get out of there. Whatever that is, it's not from our system. Disregard the 10 to 66. Return to station immediately." Miles looked at the tablet. The warning message was gone. In its place was a single, new line of text, stark white against the black screen. "Assistance located." "Too late, dispatch," Miles whispered, not to the mic, but to the forest. He looked at Flores, his face pale in the faint glow of the dash. "I think the distress call wasn't for us to answer. I think it was an invitation." He shifted the car into drive, not to turn back, but to continue down the long, dark road. "Which way, Miles?" Flores asked, her hand hovering over her sidearm. Miles pointed ahead, where the twin beams of their headlights were just beginning to illuminate something standing dead center in the middle of the road. It wasn't a deer or a person. It was a single, tall, vintage wooden police call box, the kind that disappeared from major cities 50 years ago. It hadn't been there a minute ago. It stood utterly silent, but the chilling sense of assistance located hung in the air like ozone. Towards the Echo Flores, Miles said, gripping the steering wheel. We're going to find out what filed that report. I can now continue with part 2, delving into the mystery of the antique call box and the nature of the assistance that was located. The patrol car's headlights cut through the heavy, suffocating air, illuminating the object that should not have been there. It was a classic Gamewell police call box, the iron casting painted a faded, peeling blue, standing upright and utterly alien on the cracked asphalt of old Route 80. That IT was impossibly out of place. This wasn't New York or Chicago 50 years ago. This was Blackwood Creek, where the most advanced piece of street furniture was a rusted mailbox. Miles pulled the cruiser to a halt 10 feet away. The engine, which had coughed earlier, now purred with unsettling smoothness. The digital tablet on the dash was now a blank, harmless black screen. Dispatch 7 Adam 12. We have located a stationary object on Route 80, mile marker 14. Looks like an antique police box. We are investigating. The dispatcher's voice returned, laced with confusion. Miles, are you sure? There's nothing on the GIS for anything like that. Be careful. And Miles, your call sign just disappeared from my system again. I'm tracking you on a 10-minute loop. Miles ignored the warning. He unbuckled his seatbelt. Stay here, Flores. Run the plates, if it has any. Plates? Miles, it's a box, Flores said, her voice strained. She unholstered her sidearm anyway. I'm not staying here. Not alone. Miles sighed, nodding. He knew that look. Textbook bravery mixed with abject terror. He took his flashlight and stepped out into the night. The air was dead cold immediately outside the car, a shocking contrast to the interior heat. The forest seemed to lean in, the shadows long and grasping. They approached the box cautiously. The iron was slick and cold to the touch. It had no power cables, no foundation, just sitting directly on the road, like it had been dropped from a great height seconds ago. Flores shined her light over the brass plaque set into the front. Blackwood Creek Police Department. Emergency line 1948. 1948? Miles muttered, running a gloved finger over the raised letters. This town didn't have a police department in 48. We were part of the county sheriff's jurisdiction back then. The box had a small, hinged metal door, clearly designed to be opened. A faded red handle, shaped like a small lever, jutted out from beneath it. Don't touch it, Miles warned, though Flores was already reaching for the lever. But what if it's the actual distress signal? She argued, her voice dropping to a whisper. What if someone is trapped, and this is how they called for help? Maybe they're locked inside. Miles hesitated. The logic was absurd, but the inherent duty of a police officer, the 10 to 66, the sacred distress call, was a powerful pull. He took a deep breath, pushing the strange, metallic siren sound from his mind. Fine. Stand back. He gripped the cold, hard lever and pulled. It moved with a smooth, oiled silence that was disconcerting for something so old. The hinged door swung open, revealing not a telephone receiver, but a dark, gaping void. It was too dark for his flashlight beam to penetrate, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light. Miles leaned in, his flashlight tracing the perimeter of the opening. The inside smelled overwhelmingly of ozone and wet copper, like a vast electrical substation running underwater. Hello, Miles called out, his voice sounding thin and weak that a sound returned. Not an echo and not a voice. It was a rhythmic, scratching noise, like fingernails dragging across chalk, coming from deep within the void. Then a low, wet sound that resembled heavy breathing. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted from the hole, followed by a violent, high-pitched ringing that made Miles drop his flashlight. He staggered back, covering his ears. The sound was not in the air. It was in his skull. When the light and sound subsided, Miles realized Flores was screaming. He turned, adrenaline spiking. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring past his shoulder, at the now open police box. "Miles, the message," she gasped, pointing a trembling finger. Miles turned. Slowly, the inside of the open box was no longer a black void. It was glowing with a faint, sickly green light, and etched into the smooth, dark metal panel where the phone should have been was a new message, scrawled in what looked like dried, brown ink. 7 Adam, 12. You are out of service. Perpetrator is code 10 to 66. Assistance not required. Disregard all previous orders. The message was signed with a simple, jagged symbol that looked like a broken clock face. Miles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The old 10 to 66 code meant officer needs assistance, but the box had reversed it. The perpetrator was the officer needing assistance. Before he could process this, the box emitted a final, soft click. The lever snapped back into place, pulling the door shut with absolute finality. And as the light inside vanished, the chilling, antique siren wailed one last time. Not outside, but right behind them, inside the dense pines. It was so close, Miles could feel the vibrations in his chest. "It's not an invitation, Miles," Flores whimpered, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward the car. "It's a warning, and it's locking us into its shift." Miles didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted for the cruiser, the rhythmic, wet-breathing noise now seemingly following them from the trees, and the faint, unsettling scent of ozone clinging to the night air. They had answered the call, and now they were on the schedule. The shift has started for Officers Corbin and Flores, but they are no longer under the authority of Blackwood Creek PD. They are on a different, unlisted rotation. Miles slammed the gear into drive, tire spitting gravel as the cruiser roared away from the antique call box. The only thing worse than the siren was the chilling knowledge that the call was now coming from behind them, somewhere in the deep, lightless woods. "Did you see the writing?" Flores gasped, twisting in her seat to look out the back window. It was like blood. "And who wrote it?" "Perpetrator is code 10 to 66 foot. What does that even mean?" "It means we're in a bad spot, Flores," Miles said, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "It means someone or something used the oldest distress signal they could find to drag us into their problem, and now we're the official response team." He sped for several minutes, heading back toward the main road, the police box quickly vanishing into the oppressive darkness. As they drove, the patrol car began to feel subtly different. The silence in the cabin was heavy, punctuated only by their ragged breathing. Then, Miles realized, the radio was still completely silent. "Dispatch never signed back on," Miles pointed out, glancing at the radio unit. The digital screen was dark, the indicator light off. "It's dead." Flores reached out, tapping the power button frantically. "It's not responding. It's like we drove into a pocket of dead air." Miles slowed the car again. "No, it's not dead air. It's isolated." He looked at the magnetic unit that held his shotgun between the seats. The metal gleamed faintly in the dash lights. "We need a beacon. Pull out your phone, Flores. See if you have a bar." Flores fumbled with her phone, her thumb hovering over the signal indicator. Nothing. Zero service. Not even an emergency contact. Miles felt a fresh wave of cold dread. They were operating completely blind, cut off from any outside help, exactly as the message on the box had implied. "You are out of service." Then a faint, rhythmic sound began to emanate from the back seat. Tap, tap, tap.it was the sound of a shoe lightly bouncing against the hard, rubber floor mat. Both officers froze. They had been alone in the car since they started their shift. Miles slowly turned his head to look in the rearview mirror. Flores was rigid, staring at the mirror in the reflection. They saw nothing at all. The back seat was empty, cloaked in shadow. But the tapping continued, faster now. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. "Identify yourself," Miles commanded, his voice rough. He reached for his sidearm, the cold grip a small comfort. The tapping stopped abruptly. A new sound began. A soft, wet slurping noise, like someone noisily drinking from a half-empty cup. The smell of ozone and wet copper, the same scent from the police box, flooded the car. "Miles," Flores whispered, her eyes wide. Did we bring something back with us?" Miles didn't answer. He was staring intensely at the rearview mirror. The back seat was still empty, but something was wrong with the reflection. The shadows back there seemed to be moving independently of the car's motion, churning like oil. Suddenly, a heavy, cold hand slammed onto the back of Miles's seat, inches from his head. The impact jarred the whole car. Simultaneously, a voice, a low, guttural whisper that vibrated through the seat fabric, spoke directly into Miles's ear. It wasn't loud, but it was deeply resonant, like a bass note played inside a cavern. "The report is filed. We go where the calls are." Miles instinctively slammed on the brakes and spun around, gun drawn. The back seat was completely, starkly empty. The floor mat was clean. There was no handprint, no moisture, no trace of anything at all. Flores was hyperventilating, her own gun pointed at the empty space. Where did it go? What was that? Miles slowly lowered his weapon, his mind racing. He checked the doors. Locked. The windows. Rolled up. The weight of the encounter settled heavily on him. It wasn't a physical passenger in the sense they understood. It was something they had activated or summoned by opening that box. Something that was now riding shotgun to their minds. Miles put the car back in gear and started driving slowly. He had to be calm. He was the senior officer. "We go back to the station," he said firmly. "We report this, even if the radio is dead. We drive out of this dead zone." As the patrol car picked up speed, a small, laminated card fluttered down from the air vent above the driver's side. It was a standard PD incident report form, but it was filled out with the same dried, brown ink from the box. Miles snatched it midair, his eyes scanning the chilling details. The box for reporting officer was filled in with his own call sign. 7 Adam, 12 Miles Corbin. The box for nature of incident read, permanent patrol reassignment, and the final line at the bottom was a single, terrifying case file number, case 10-66/Blackwood Creek/1948 Miles looked down the road. They weren't heading back to the precinct. A dim, yellow light was now visible in the distance, the exact location where, years ago, an abandoned, sealed-off railway tunnel was located. "Miles," Flores whispered, pointing. "That's not the station route. That's the tunnel." Miles knew the name. Everyone in Blackwood Creek knew it. The tunnel was rumored to be the site of a tragic, unexplained disappearance of a police officer decades ago. "The case file," Miles murmured, staring at the number on the paper. "We're not driving back to the station, Flores. We've been dispatched to the scene of a 60-year-old missing persons report. The officers have been forcibly assigned to a cold case tied to the same unsettling year as the call box." The abandoned railway tunnel loomed ahead like a gigantic, stone mouth, swallowing the scant moonlight. It was less than a mile from a location of the call box. A coincidence that Miles knew was anything, but the light they had seen was not a utility lamp. It was a single bare bulb, hanging by a frayed wire just inside the tunnel's concrete entrance, casting a sickly, flickering yellow aura. This light had not been operational for decades. The power to the old railway line was cut in 1965, but Miles parked the cruiser some distance away. They moved on foot, the gravel crunching loudly under their boots, the sound echoing unnaturally in the heavy silence. "Miles, we need to call this in," Flores insisted, flashlight beam cutting nervously through the trees. "Unauthorized entry, faulty equipment, a suspicious scene. This is all wrong." "And how are we going to call it in, Flores?" Miles asked, holding up his dead radio. "The moment we touched that box, we were put on a different frequency. Look around. We're in a bubble, and this is our assignment." He shone his own powerful flashlight at the tunnel entrance. A chain-link fence, rusted and bent, was pushed inward, suggesting a recent forced entry. "The case file number," Miles said, pulling out the eerie report card. 1948. That's when the legend of Officer Thomas Hale started. The guy who vanished without a trace inside this tunnel. He was the only cop in Blackwood Creek back then, just a county auxiliary. They stepped through the broken fence. The air immediately grew colder, dense with the smell of wet earth, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of smoke and coal dust. The sound of the flickering bulb was the only break in the silence, a sharp, almost frantic zee sound. Flores pointed to the ground. Footprints. They were heavy boot prints, deep in the dust that covered the tunnel entrance. Miles knelt to examine them. They weren't their boots. They were far larger, with an archaic tread pattern. They're old, Miles noted, but fresh, like they were made a minute ago by someone wearing 50-year-old gear. As they moved deeper, the tunnel walls, damp and covered in moss, began to narrow. The yellow light barely reached. Flores suddenly stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Her flashlight was fixed on the wall to their right. A chalk outline, drawn crudely on the rough concrete. It was the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure, laid flat, knees slightly bent, an arm stretched out. A standard police scene marker, but the chalk was not white. It was the same dried, brownish-red ink that scrawled the message on the call box and the incident report. "The scene of the crime," Flores whispered, her voice barely audible. Miles felt the chill of the tunnel turn into a creeping paralysis. He shined his light higher up the wall and saw it, a single, dark stain. It was high up, almost near the ceiling, suggesting whatever caused it had been tossed or dragged violently. And near the chalk outline's outstretched hand, scrawled into the concrete with a sharp, deep gouge, was a single word. It was a desperate, primal plea, and it looked like it was done with something hard, possibly a fingernail or a knife point. Miles moved his flashlight beam away from the terrifying plea and toward the floor. The archaic footprints led straight into the darkness. Suddenly, a loud clatter echoed from deep within the tunnel, the unmistakable sound of metal on concrete. Miles drew his gun, raising it level. "Police, identify yourself." No answer, only the ZET of the flickering light bulb. Flores, her eyes wide with terror, pointed a shaking finger deeper into the tunnel. "Miles, look at the bulb." The flickering yellow light was intensifying, burning brighter and hotter than it should, bathing the immediate area in a harsh, sickly glow. As the light grew, it cast the shadows of the two officers onto the far tunnel wall, but their shadows were wrong. Miles's shadow was elongated and thin, his gun replaced by the bulky outline of an old-fashioned revolver. Flores's shadow was similarly distorted, her modern uniform replaced by a heavy, high-collared jacket and a strange, wide-brimmed cap. They were not seeing their own shadows. They were seeing the shadows of 1948. And then, a third shadow appeared, projected onto the wall, much closer to the light source. It was a tall, heavy figure, its head covered in the same archaic cap. The shadow moved, and Miles realized it was directly behind him. He spun around, Flores screaming. There was nothing there, but the distinct, wet slurping sound from the car was back, closer, seeming to come from the very rock wall. "Don't look at the walls," Miles yelled, his voice strained. "Stay focused." He took a step forward, towards the source of the clatter. Flores, trembling, followed. They found the object next to a small, wooden railway tie. It was a copper whistle, tarnished and cracked, the kind attached to an officer's uniform. It was the exact source of the metallic clatter they had heard. Miles picked it up. It was ice cold as he held it. The whistle began to vibrate violently in his palm, and a distorted whisper, like radio feedback, filled his mind. "File the report, Miles." It was self-defense. They always blamed the last one on duty. The tunnel bulb finally burst with a blinding flash and a loud pop, plunging them into absolute darkness. Miles's eyes, adjusting to the sudden dark, caught the briefest glimpse of a silhouette rushing toward them from the depths of the tunnel. A tall, heavy figure wearing a cap, but its face was a blur of raw, shrieking shadow. "Run!" Miles roared, dragging Flores by the arm, plunging headlong back towards the mouth of the tunnel, and the only light they had left, their cruiser's headlights. They were no longer investigating a cold case. They were being hunted by it. Officers Corbin and Flores have encountered the ghostly remnants of Officer Hale and perhaps the entity that took him. They are now in a life-or-death scenario in the tunnel. Miles and Flores stumbled back towards the tunnel mouth, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against the roar of their own panic. The absolute darkness made the air feel thick and viscous, and the chilling, wet slurping sound was now accompanied by the distinct, Frantic squeak of heavy leather soles sliding on damp concrete. Flashlight, find the door. Miles yelled, scrambling to find the powerful beam. He had dropped Flores, tears blurring her vision, located her own flashlight, and fumbled with the switch. When the beam finally flared to life, it illuminated a terrifying sight. The chalk outline on the wall was no longer an outline. It was filled in, a dark, pulsing silhouette that seemed to be breathing with the rhythm of the wet slurping noise. They didn't stop to look. They burst through the broken chain-link fence, gulping down lungfuls of the relatively cleaner night air. The sight of their patrol car, a beacon of modernity and jurisdiction, was a desperate comfort. They threw themselves into the cruiser, Miles wrenching the key in the ignition. The engine struggled, sputtered, and then finally caught with a straining roar. Go! Go! Flores screamed. Miles floored the gas pedal. As the car spun onto the road, the headlights caught a flash of movement at the tunnel entrance. That a figure emerged. That IT was tall, heavily built, and dressed in a dark, arcade police uniform, a high-collared jacket, and the strange, wide-brimmed cap they had seen in the shadow. The uniform was the faded, almost black shade of old, dried canvas. The figure was not running. It was walking with a strange, heavy, lurching gait, its head down, but its footsteps made the unnerving sound of the antique shoe tread they had observed. Miles sped past, tires screaming. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The figure had stopped directly in the middle of the road, bathed in the red glow of their taillights. It raised one arm slowly, its movement stiff and unnatural, and pointed a heavy, gloved finger at the retreating car. Then, from the spot where the figure stood, the chilling, mechanical siren wailed once more, sharp and punishing, immediately overloading the cruiser's silent radio system with a massive wave of static. The static was so violent it caused the dashboard lights to flicker and fail, momentarily plunging the interior into blackness. Miles wrestled the steering wheel, trying to keep the car on the road. It's a cop, Miles. Flores yelled, wiping her eyes. It's the missing officer. Officer Hale. Hale vanished, Flores. Miles countered, his voice raw. That thing, it's not looking for assistance. It's looking for a replacement. He looked down at the incident report card still clutched in his hand. Perpetrator is code 10 to 66. Miles's mind finally connected the terrible dots. The 10 to 66 code meant officer needs assistance. But if the perpetrator was the officer needing assistance, then the thing they had seen wasn't Hale the victim. The perpetrator is the cop needing help, Miles repeated, a cold knot forming in his gut. He was the one who filed the report, the one who caused the disappearance. The thought was instantly confirmed by a new, insidious sound coming from the back seat. Not a tap or a slurping, but a low, hollow chuckle cough. Cough. Miles gripped the steering wheel, trying to ignore the sound. They had to get back to civilization, but he drove hard for another 5 minutes. They reached the edge of the dead zone, where the pine forest finally gave way to the sparse outskirts of Blackwood Creek. They saw the welcome, blurry lights of the first houses. Then the siren's echo came one last time, very soft this time, almost mournful, right in front of them. Miles slammed on the brakes, throwing them forward. Standing in the exact center of the street, blocking their path, was the Gamewell police, called Box.IT was impossible. They had driven miles. It followed us. Flores gasped, her voice hoarse. It beat us here. Miles knew it hadn't followed them. It had been dispatched ahead of them, a tool of the permanent patrol reassignment. He looked at the box, then glanced quickly at the street signs. They were on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the town center. Their destination, the heavy, black-clad figure they had seen at the tunnel, was now visible again, emerging from the shadows of a nearby house. It was closing the distance slowly, methodically. Miles had 2 choices: ram the call box and risk disabling the car, or face the approaching figure. He opted for a third. He pulled a sharp U-turn, heading back towards the tunnel route, desperate to find an alternate road back to town. As he turned, a detail on the call box caught his eye. A new object now resting on its small, pyramidal roof. A tarnished, heavy badge, clearly from the 1948 Blackwood Creek Police Auxiliary. glinting faintly in the cruiser's headlights, and etched into the brass of the badge. A single, horrifying engraving. T. Hale. He's giving us his badge, Miles said, the realization causing his hands to shake. He's trying to pass the watch to the next officer on duty. Flores was crying now, but she was still holding her gun steady. Miles, we have to fight this. We have to break the assignment. How? Miles demanded, swerving to avoid a patch of unusually deep shadow on the road. Suddenly, their dead radio burst to life, with a clean, clear voice. The dispatchers. 7 Adam 12, are you receiving? You've been off the map. Where are you? We have a 911 call. Domestic dispute in progress. 122, Elm Street. Respond immediately. Miles's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. The black-clad figure was gone. The call box was gone. The world had snapped back into place. But 122, Elm Street? That was the exact address they had just fled. The house next to where the figure had emerged. Miles answered the mic, his voice steadier than he felt. Dispatch 7 Adam 12. Receiving you loud and clear. Proceeding to 122, Elm Street. Requesting backup. He looked at Flores. The assignment isn't broken, Flores. We just got the first call of the shift. The officers are back in the jurisdiction of the living, but their first normal call is suspiciously tied to the entity they just encountered. Miles drove the remaining few blocks toward 122, Elm Street, his thoughts a chaotic scramble. The abrupt return to normal radio function felt like a cruel trick. Were they out of the dead zone, or had the dead zone simply merged with their reality? The incident report card, however, was still a physical, terrifying reality. It was tucked into his breast pocket, the badge of T. Hale was not on the roof of the car, but Miles felt a faint, lingering pressure on the skin of his chest, as if the cold metal had somehow transferred. Dispatch is sending 7 Adam 14 Miles, Flores reported, her eyes scanning the dark, suburban street. 10-minute ETA. 10 minutes is an eternity, Miles muttered. Keep your guard up. This is too convenient. They arrived at 122, Elm Street. It was a modest, 2-story house, dark except for a single, flickering light in an upstairs window. Miles parked the cruiser. The car felt heavy, inert. Clear your head, Flores. We're on a standard 911 now. Domestic. We follow procedure. They exited the vehicle. The night was now quiet, lacking the suffocating tension of the forest. But the smell of ozone still hung faintly in the air. They approached the front porch. The faint, distorted sound of jazz music began to drift out from the house. The kind of brassy, crackling sound that could only come from an ancient radio speaker. Miles checked the front door. Locked. He knocked, loud and authoritative. Blackwood Creek Police. We need to speak with the occupants. Silence. Miles knocked again. Suddenly, a woman's muffled voice shrieked from upstairs, followed by the deep, angry rumble of a man's voice. The argument was too distorted to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pure, uncontrolled rage. We're going in, Miles decided. Flores, cover the rear. If you see anything, and I mean anything that isn't human, you call it in. Flores nodded grimly. Miles used the butt of his heavy flashlight to smash the glass pane next to the front doorknob. Reaching in to unlock it, the door swung open. The air rushing out of the house hit Miles like a physical blow. It was the pungent, stale smell of an old building, but layered over it was the overwhelming, acrid scent of cheap cigar smoke and stale liquor. The signature smell of the 1940s. The house was eerily dark, the walls papered in floral patterns long out of fashion. Everything was covered in a film of dust. 10 Adam 12 is entering the premises, Miles announced, drawing his sidearm, the sound of his modern nylon uniform scratching against the antique silence that he moved into the living room. The jazz music was louder here, emanating from a large, heavy wooden radio cabinet in the corner. The radio's green display glowed faintly, showing a frequency Miles didn't recognize. Flores rejoined him, her eyes wide. Miles, the backyard, it's been paved over recently, but under the fresh cement, I think I saw something. Like a depression, and the smell of copper is stronger back there. Later. Upstairs, Miles ordered, moving toward the staircase As he reached the bottom step, the jazz music abruptly cut out, replaced by a familiar sound, the metallic, overdriven static of the dead radio zone. And then, the voice of the man upstairs, now clear and frighteningly close, echoing down the stairwell. "I told you. We settled this ourselves. Where is the badge?" Miles started up the stairs, Flores right behind him. The air grew rapidly colder on the landing. The flickering light they had seen through the window came from a single, bare bulb hanging in a dusty hallway. They followed the sounds to a bedroom door, which was hanging slightly ajar. Miles cautiously kicked the door open. The room was a domestic disaster. Furniture overturned, a lamp broken. In the center of the room, two figures were locked in a terrified struggle at a distraught woman in a heavy, knee-length dress, clothing decades out of style, was trying to pull something from the hand of a large, enraged man in a stained, short-sleeved white undershirt and suspenders. The man saw Miles and Flores, and he froze, his face contorted in drunken fury. "Who are you? Get out of my house. I didn't call the police," he screamed, his voice thick with alcohol. Miles raised his weapon. "Police, drop whatever you're holding. Step away from the woman." The man tightened his grip on the object he was wrestling for. It was a leather-bound ledger or logbook. Suddenly, the man looked directly at Miles, his eyes briefly glowing with an unsettling, amber light. His voice changed, dropping the drunken slur for a precise, cold rasp. 7 Adam 12. "This is police business. Interference is forbidden. You are 10 to 66. He released the book, shoved the woman violently backward, and lunged not at Miles, but at Flores. As he moved, Miles saw the man's features momentarily blur and shift, his skin taking on the sickly gray-green hue of the tunnel light. Flores didn't hesitate. She fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The sound of the modern firearm in the 1940s-era room was deafening. Dust and plaster rained down. The man froze, momentarily startled by the blast. He then looked down at his own chest, where a dark, sticky liquid was now quickly staining the front of his undershirt. Miles realized, with sickening clarity, that the man was already injured, and the wound was fresh. The woman, capitalizing on the distraction, grabbed the leather-bound book and hurled it across the room. It skidded to a halt at Miles's feet. Miles took his eyes off the assailant for a split second to look down at the book. It was a Blackwood Creek PD patrol log, dated October 1948. When he looked back up, the man was gone. The woman was gone. The room was silent, clean, and empty. The dust was thick again. The overturned furniture was upright. The scent of cigar smoke and liquor had vanished, replaced by the sterile, cold air of an abandoned room. Miles and Flores were standing alone in a dusty, derelict bedroom. Flores dropped her gun, shaking uncontrollably. Where did they go? Miles, where did the scene go? Miles bent down slowly and picked up the patrol log. It was heavy and cold. He opened the cover. The first entry, in neat, faded cursive, was dated October 31st, 1948. Read, "Officer Hale, code 10 to 66. Report filed at 122 Elm Street. Domestic dispute escalated. Perp secured. End of shift." And scrawled violently across the bottom of the page, in the same familiar dried brown ink, was the message: "The perpetrator was me. And now I am the assistance." Miles knew. The scene hadn't been a recent domestic dispute. They had just walked into, and briefly interfered with, a 60-year-old crime in progress, reliving the moment that led to Officer Hale's disappearance and the subsequent filing of his dark report. "We're not just on a case, Flores," Miles whispered, holding the heavy logbook. "We're trapped inside the incident report itself." Miles and Flores are now actively interfering with the past, trapped within the parameters of Officer Hale's final, corrupted patrol. Miles and Flores backed out of 122 Elm Street, their minds reeling from the temporal violation they had just experienced. They were standing in the quiet, modern Blackwood Creek night, yet Miles clutched a heavy, cold logbook that smelled of the 1940s. The incident report card was gone from his pocket, replaced by the crushing weight of the patrol log. Flores leaned against the cruiser, trying to regain her composure. "We have to turn this book over to the chief. Now." It's evidence of whatever this is. Miles shook his head, running a trembling hand over the book's brittle leather cover. No, Flores. The book is the key. The siren, the call box, the 10 to 66 message. It's all a system. And this logbook is the system's schedule. He opened the logbook again, flipping past the chilling final entry from Officer Hale. The subsequent pages were blank, dated sequentially through 1949, 1950, and so on, right up until the present day, November 9th, 2025. The entries for the entire 60-year span were clean and used, waiting to be filled. Miles stopped at the page for today's date. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in the familiar brown ink, was a single, cryptic instruction. Next dispatch, 3 o'clock hours. Incident: break-in/St. Jude Sanatorium. Condemned. Flores peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening in horror. St. Jude's? That place was condemned 30 years ago. It's miles out of town, on private land. Not on our shift, it isn't, Miles said, his voice flat. He looked at his watch. 2:52 a.m. They had 8 minutes. This isn't just a log, Flores. It's a pre-written script. Hale, or whatever is wearing his uniform, is forcing us to follow his patrol route, finishing the calls he never did. Miles keyed his dead radio, even though he knew it was futile. We need to get out of this town's jurisdiction. We need to drive until the book stops dispatching us. Before he could put the car into drive, a new sound cut through the silence. A faint, low chime, like a tiny bell ringing once. It came from the back of the car. Miles looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but lying dead center on the worn pleather was a small, black object. He reached back slowly and picked it up. It was an old-fashioned key, heavy and made of tarnished iron, tied with a piece of brittle, red thread. Flores gasped. What is that? Miles turned it over in his palm. It was a skeleton key, the kind used for old lockboxes or heavy wooden doors. It's part of the equipment, Miles stated, placing the key on the dash. We're being equipped for the next call. He drove quickly and silently toward the highway that led out of Blackwood Creek. But as they drove, the map on the dead digital tablet suddenly flickered back to life. Ignoring the power outage, the familiar map of Blackwood Creek was displayed, but the screen was overlaid with a single, aggressive red line tracing their path. It was a digital map, but the line was drawn in the style of the dried, brown ink. And when Miles tried to turn left onto the highway entrance ramp, the red line veered violently right, directing them down a dark, unpaved service road towards the outskirts. Miles felt a cold rush of futility. It won't let us leave. We are confined to its patrol boundaries. He slowed the car, forced to obey the terrifyingly persistent navigation. We go to St. Jude's. We follow the log, and we look for a way to break the pattern. As they drove down the deserted service road, they passed a single, derelict warehouse. Miles glanced at it, and the fleeting image from the 122 Elm Street incident flashed in his mind. The blurring, gray-green face of the enraged man. The report is filed, Miles. The perpetrator was code 10 to 66, Miles mumbled, trying to make sense of the inverted code. Officer Hale was the perpetrator. He's the one who needs assistance hiding his crime, and now we're the ones forced to help him secure the scenes. They arrived at St. Jude Sanatorium. It was a massive, Gothic structure, skeletal against the sky, surrounded by a high, broken iron fence. It was the picture of institutional decay. Miles checked his watch. 3:0, 1 a.m.as if on cue. A faint, high-pitched rattling sound started up from inside the building. It sounded like chains being dragged across a stone floor. Miles turned off the engine. The only thing they could hear now was the rhythmic, metallic clink of the chains. Flores pointed to a side entrance, where the heavy wooden door was ajar, hanging crookedly on one hinge. The break-in. Miles grabbed his shotgun and the heavy iron key from the dash. Let's go, officer. We've got a break-in to secure. Before they left the car, Miles opened the logbook one last time. Under the instruction for the break-in, a new line had appeared, scrawled in the same dark ink. Evidence. Missing entry 13. Secure primary lockbox. Miles looked at the skeleton key in his hand, then at the massive, echoing darkness of the sanatorium. The key was clearly for the primary lockbox. "We're not securing a crime scene, Flores," Miles stated, his voice barely a whisper. "We're retrieving evidence for a dead cop's personal files." As they stepped out of the cruiser and moved toward the sanatorium, the rhythmic clinking of chains from within stopped. It was replaced by the low, haunting sound of the siren's echo, muffled and distant, as if coming from an underground level. They had found the scene, but the entity in the black uniform had found them. Miles and Flores are now inside the condemned sanatorium, forced to retrieve evidence for Officer Hale. Miles and Flores stepped into St. Jude's Care Institute. The air instantly grew heavy, cold, and thick with the stench of old disinfectant, mold, and rusted metal. Their flashlights didn't cut the darkness so much as expose the decay. Shattered terrazzo tiles, scraped and peeling walls, and cell doors hanging crooked, stripped of their hinges. The distant, distorted wail of an alarm still echoed somewhere far off, but now it sounded less like a warning and more like a long, tortured moan rising from deep beneath the building's foundations. "This key has to open something important," Miles said, tightening his grip on the shotgun and the old iron key. "It's not for any main door. It's got to be for a lockbox." They followed the main corridor. Empty gurneys and overturned wheelchairs were scattered across the floor. At the far end, Flora spotted something that made her blood run cold. "Miles, look at this," she whispered, raising her light to an old bulletin board. It was a patrol schedule, rotted and yellowed, names and shifts written in fountain pen. The date at the top was 1951, and one name, circled in dried brown ink, appeared again. OFC Hale. He was patrolling here after he disappeared. Flores asked, voice shaking. "He never vanished. He just changed posts." "Or," Miles said quietly, "he kept working his shift, and we're the ones who replaced him at Blackwood Creek. 2 watches, one old, one new, forced to run parallel." They found the records archive in the basement, a cold concrete room sealed behind a heavy steel door. This one had 2 locks, an electronic keypad above, long dead, and a wide, ancient brass keyhole below. Miles slid the iron key into the brass lock. It seated perfectly. With a dry, final clack, both locks released. Inside, there were no filing cabinets, only a small, old iron box bolted into the wall. The primary lockbox. Miles shot the lock off the box. Inside, there was no cash, no classified documents, just a single unmarked cassette tape and a small sheet of paper folded into quarters. Miles unfolded the note first. Written in brown ink, it contained only one line. Entry 13. St. Jude's, Patient X, final assignment. Do not listen. They said don't listen. Flores whispered. "Miles, we've pushed this too far. We should stop." Hale was trying to bury his own evidence, Miles said, staring at the cassette. "This is the missing case file. We need to know what he did to get out of that eternal shift." He took a handheld recorder from his coat, modern, but with a cassette deck. He slid the tape in and pressed play. The first sound was air rushing through ventilation shafts, then the slow, heavy footsteps of Officer Hale. The recording began with Hale's voice, hoarse, tired. Log, 3:15 a.m., October 31st, 1948. St. Jude's. Reached designated point. Searching for entry 13. The patient who was cleared under orders. "Under whose orders?" Flores murmured. Hale's voice cut off. Then came a long dragging noise, like something very heavy being pushed. Next, a second voice entered the tape, a woman's voice, frail, trembling, desperate. "No, you can't do this. They promised. I helped you. I told you about the lockbox. I told you about my husband's death on Elm Street. You said you wouldn't." Hale's voice returned, now cold and utterly merciless. "You are entry 13. You are the evidence. I can't let anyone know I put him down. I have to erase this shift. You know too much." The recording ended with a sharp, brutal impact, a smothered scream, and the clang of metal cuffs hitting stone. Then dead silence. Finally, Hale spoke again, but his voice was no longer human. It carried the same warped, crushing tone Miles had heard in the patrol car. Record closed. Entry 13 has been cleaned. Just need to finalize the report. I will always be reassigned. I am the one who needs assistance. I am 10 to 66. The tape clicked to a stop. Miles pulled it out. His hand was shaking. Hale wasn't a victim. Hale had killed the man in the domestic homicide on Elm Street, then murdered the woman at St. Jude's to cover it up. And then he'd used his own death as a final report, one that forced every replacement officer to reenact his crimes. Suddenly, the cold in the archive hit them like a wall. The distant alarm cut off, and a firm knocking came from the steel door they had just opened. Knock, knock, knock. Miles, Flores backed away, gun trained on the entrance. There's no one else in here. Miles knew exactly who was at the door. He looked down at the patrol log. A fresh line had appeared beneath entry 13. Shift change. Officer Hale has arrived. The steel door began to swing shut again, slowly, deliberately, locking them inside the record's archive. Hale's distorted voice came from the other side, louder, clearer than ever, thick with grotesque satisfaction. 7 Adam 12. Your shift is over. It's my turn to clear the scene. I've received your report. Lockbox inspected. Case file complete. His words ended with a wet, familiar slurp. Miles understood the worst of it. If Hale had received their report, it meant one thing. They had finished their role in the ghost shift. He stared at the logbook as new lines burned themselves onto the page, documenting a fresh case file. Date, November 9th, 2025. Missing officers, 7 Adam, 12 Miles Corbin and Flores. Evidence, patrol logbook. Transferred to next assigned officer. No, Miles roared, hurling the logbook to the floor. It landed without a sound, motionless on the freezing concrete. Hale's voice came one last time, right beyond the steel. Thank you for your service. Now, you're the call, and I'm the eternal night shift. Miles and Flores were sealed in, and their shift had just been used to create the next disappearance. The heavy, steel door to the records room slammed shut with a final, echoing thud, plunging Miles and Flores into absolute darkness. The lock, activated by Officer Hale's unseen presence, clicked with chilling finality. Flores screamed, a sharp, raw sound of pure terror. Miles, adrenaline overriding panic, fumbled for his flashlight. Flores, calm down. We still have our sidearms, he shouted, his voice echoing too loudly in the confined space. The beam of his flashlight cut through the oppressive dark, illuminating the cold, damp concrete walls. The 1948 patrol log lay where he had dropped it, its cover reflecting the harsh light. He's locking us in. He's erasing us. Flora sobbed, pressing her back against the far wall. Miles rushed to the door, slamming his shoulder against the unyielding steel. It didn't budge. He aimed his shotgun at the thick, external locking mechanism. Stand back, Flores. He fired. The blast ripped through the metal with a deafening roar. Shrapnel flew, and the air filled with the sharp scent of gunpowder. Miles lowered the smoking shotgun. The lock was damaged, but the mechanism still held the door firmly shut. They were trapped. Then, from the other side of the door, a low, wet gurgle began, followed by a metallic clink-clink-clink sound. The same sound of chains they had heard earlier. Officer Hale was securing the scene. Miles turned back to the room, grabbing the cursed logbook. He flipped to the page where their own fate had just been scrawled. Officer missing, 7 Adam 12. He's operating on duty logs, Flores. He's using our own system against us. Miles realized, his mind racing. The moment we completed his request, securing entry 13, we became the evidence he needed to close the 1948 file. Our disappearance is the end of shift report. Flores, wiping her tears, pointed to a thick, dark stain on the concrete floor in the corner of the room. Look, Miles. Down here. Miles aimed his light. The stain was large, deep, and appeared to be very old, smelling faintly of the copper and ozone that permeated the whole patrol. This is where he secured entry 13, Miles murmured, realizing they were standing in the precise spot where Officer Hale had committed murder and filed his false report. Suddenly, A faint, high-pitched whistling started, the sound of air rushing through a small gap. Miles traced the sound to a tiny crack in the back wall. There must be a ventilation shaft or a maintenance access. Miles said he shoved the logbook into his jacket and began working at the cracked concrete with the butt of his shotgun. Desperate to widen the gap as he worked, a new, louder noise began to resonate from the steel door. The chilling, mechanical siren's echo, muffled but incredibly powerful, seeming to vibrate the very air in their lungs. The siren was a distraction. Miles kept working, sweat beading on his brow. Then, the whispering started, not from Hale, but from the air itself. Faint, panicked, overlapping voices, the chorus they had heard over the static in the patrol car. He didn't answer. The perpetrator is the officer. He needed help, not us. Miles finally managed to dislodge a large piece of concrete. A gust of fetid air blew into the room. He aimed his light into the hole and saw a narrow, vertical ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for Flores to squeeze through. "Flores, you go first. Now," Miles urged, pulling her toward the gap. She hesitated, looking at him with desperate hope. "And you?" "I'm the senior officer on this shift," Miles said, forcing a grim smile. "I finished the log." As Flores began to squeeze into the shaft, Miles heard the horrifying sound of keys jingling from the other side of the steel door. Hale was using a master key. Miles grabbed the logbook and flipped to the next empty page. The page detailing the next officer's shift, perhaps the next unwitting pair that the call box would summon. That he grabbed a pen from his pocket, his hand shaking violently, and began to write, scrawling as fast as he could across the top of the blank page. Overriding the systems. Schedule, interim log, 3:20 hours, November 9th, 2025. Reporting officer, 7 Adam, 12 Corbin. Incident, shift swap violation. Perpetrator, Hale, secured. Reassigned to temporary holding. That he had to change the rules of the system. He wasn't filing his own missing report. He was arresting Hale and taking command of the supernatural patrol. The lock on the steel door snapped open with a terrible crunch. The heavy door began to creak inward. Miles tossed the completed logbook into the ventilation shaft after Flores. "Take this. Get out of Blackwood Creek. Use the new entry. Break the cycle," he yelled. Flores, halfway through the shaft, was crying as she reached for the book. Miles drew his sidearm and turned to face the opening door. The figure in the black, high-collared uniform, Officer T. Hale, stood silhouetted against the dark corridor, the antique light from a distant window catching the wet sheen on his face, a face that was a shifting mass of shadow and rage. Hale let out the low, guttural whisper. "You interfere with the patrol. The log is my evidence." Miles raised his weapon, the modern 9mm pointed at the 48 entity. "Your patrol is over, Hale," Miles said, his voice steady now. "You're off the schedule. I just filed your new assignment." Miles has sacrificed himself to override the log and save Flores. As the heavy steel door creaked fully open, revealing the imposing, shadowy figure of Officer T. Hale, Miles fired. The modern round struck the center mass of the black uniformed entity with a hollow, metallic thunk. The impact didn't stop Hale. It merely caused the shadow swirling around his face to intensify, coiling outward like black smoke. The sound of the blast was immediately absorbed, replaced by the deep, resonating gurgle of the entity's distorted breathing. Hale raised a massive, gloved hand, its movement surprisingly fast, and grabbed the muzzle of Miles's gun. The metal of the sidearm instantly turned cold, covered in a thin, visible layer of frost. "You can't arrest a report, 7 Adam 12, Hale whispered, the sound vibrating the floor. "You can only become one." Miles, buying precious seconds, saw Flores finally pull herself through the narrow ventilation shaft, the heavy logbook clutched to her chest. "Go. Run. Don't look back." Miles screamed. The last thing Flores saw before sliding into the darkness of the shaft was Hale effortlessly twisting the sidearm from Miles's hand, the old-fashioned copper whistle from the tunnel now dangling from the strap of Hale's coat. Flores tumbled into a narrow maintenance crawlspace, the damp concrete bruising her knees. She didn't hesitate. Driven by Miles's sacrifice, She crawled forward, propelled by a primal fear and the need to deliver the deadly evidence. The crawl space was labyrinthine, reeking of sewer gas and decay. She scrambled until she found a loose grate and kicked it open, dropping down into a dark boiler room. She ran, using her flashlight, out of the sanatorium's rear service exit and into the cold night. She threw herself into the driver's seat of the patrol car. Her hands were shaking too violently to insert the key. She gripped the leather-bound logbook and forced herself to breathe, her eyes fixed on the time on the dash. 3:25 a.m. Miles's last entry, the act of defiance, had happened only minutes ago. She threw the gear into drive and sped away from St. Jude's. The chilling chains and the siren's echo quickly faded behind her as she drove toward the highway, away from Blackwood Creek. She pulled the logbook onto her lap, forcing herself to look at the last entry Miles had written. Hale secured. Reassigned to temporary holding. She needed to know if it had worked. Miles had completed the interim log. The subsequent page, the one meant to document the next unwitting officer's shift, was no longer blank, scrawled neatly across the top of the next page. In the same dark, brown ink, was the official response from the system. The new command. Interim log approved. Perpetrator 10 to 66, Hale. Status. Temporary holding.it worked. Miles's final report, his arrest, had been accepted by the system. Hale was off the patrol, but the relief was instantly crushed by the lines that followed. The system's designation of the new reporting officer and the next dispatch. Reporting officer, 7 Adam, 12 Flores. Next dispatch, 4 o'clock hours. Incident, escort duty. Transport of temporary holding. Flores gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles cracked. She wasn't free. She had merely taken Miles's place as the current officer assigned to the perpetual shift. Her patrol was now dedicated to securing the thing that had just hunted them. She looked at the time. 3:40 a.m. 20 minutes until the next dispatch. She knew one thing. She couldn't answer the call. She had to destroy the logbook, destroy the system, before the assignment could be completed. She spotted a derelict overpass ahead. The same structure that had cut the power to the old railway line decades ago. She pulled the car off the road and climbed out, her sidearm ready. She poured the patrol car's lukewarm coffee over the thick pages, hoping to ruin the ink. But the bizarre, dried brown script remained untouched, almost shimmering. She tried to tear the pages, but the paper felt like dried leather, completely unyielding. The logbook was indestructible. She had to try to file a final, definitive report, a permanent resolution. She opened the book to the final blank page and began to write, frantically trying to mimic the formal police cadence, creating a final, irreversible report that would shut the patrol down forever. Final resolution. 3:55 hours. Officer Flores, 7 Adam 12. Incident. Permanent decommissioning of Patrol 1948. Disposition. All evidence, logbook, destroyed. She stopped writing as she heard the all-too-familiar metallic clatter echoing from beneath the overpass. The sound of the copper whistle, a chilling, distorted burst of the antique siren's echo erupted, closer than ever. The patrol car's lights began to flash rapidly, and the digital clock on the dash violently flipped to 4:00 a.m. The dispatch was active. From beneath the overpass, a low, rasping voice spoke, not Hale's, but a new voice, weary and cold. The voice of a dispatcher who had been waiting for 60 years. 7 Adam 12. Proceed with escort. We've got a tight schedule, officer. Don't fall behind. Flores looked down at the logbook. The lines she had just written were fading, dissolving into the blank page. The system had rejected her final resolution, that I in its place. A single, horrifying instruction appeared, written in a bold, final script. Escort duty commenced. Your temporary holding unit is located in the rear of your patrol vehicle. Flores turned slowly, her flashlight beam fixed on the back seat of her cruiser. There was a dark, heavy shape there now, covered by a black canvas blanket, the color of Officer Hale's uniform. It was silent, contained. Flores swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She was alone, the last officer on a haunted patrol, tasked with escorting the very thing that had taken her partner. Flores is now Hale's unwitting jailer, forced to transport him on his own dark shift. Flores stood frozen by the side of the cruiser, the logbook slipping from her numb fingers. The dark shape in the back seat, Officer Hale, her temporary holding unit, was silent, but its presence was an overwhelming, suffocating weight. She forced herself to move, retrieved the logbook, and checked the next entry. The log, now actively guiding her, showed a new destination. Escort route, OLD Blackwood Creek Bridge. Termination point, M 31. At mile marker 31 was the middle of the river, the deepest, fastest part of the Blackwood Creek, where the original support pylons for the abandoned railway bridge still stood. "No," Flores whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not driving him there. I'm not sinking a police unit." She jammed the logbook into the glove compartment and threw the cruiser into reverse, intending to drive straight to the nearest county sheriff's office. Immediately, the patrol car's dashboard lights flickered violently, and the engine gave a loud, painful groan, shaking the entire vehicle. A shrill, prolonged blast of the antique siren erupted from the back seat, causing the glass in the rear window to shudder. Flora slammed on the brakes. The cruiser was fighting her, physically resisting the attempt to leave the assigned route. The dark canvas blanket in the back seat shifted slightly. Flores knew she couldn't outrun the assignment. Hale was secured, but the patrol was still in command, using her to complete his final, dark task, disposing of the evidence. She put the car back on the escort route, tears of frustration and terror streaming down her face. As she drove, she reached for the microphone of her radio, which was now stubbornly functional, connected to the normal dispatch. She knew this was her last chance. "Dispatch, this is 7 Adam 12, she said, her voice strained but firm. "I need emergency assistance. Code 3, officer in distress. Requesting all available units to my location on Old River Road. I have a suspect in custody and a possible 10 to 57 possible fatality." The dispatcher's voice, crisp and professional, came back instantly. 7 Adam 12, confirm your status. You sounded strained. What is the nature of the emergency? Flores knew she couldn't tell them about the cursed logbook or the ghost cop. She had to use official terms. "I have a perp, Officer Thomas Hale, restrained in the back seat. He's connected to 2 potential homicides, one decades old, one just minutes ago. I need immediate, overwhelming support to transport and secure this suspect. He's actively interfering with the vehicle and communication systems." A short pause from the dispatcher. 7 Adam 12, we show no record of an Officer Thomas Hale in custody. Are you reporting a hostile trespasser? Where is Officer Corbin? Flores glanced at the logbook in the glove compartment, knowing the system had already scrubbed miles from the active roster. "Officer Corbin is unavailable. I am the reporting officer. Look, just send the units. I'm approaching the Blackwood Creek Bridge. I need lights and guns now." The dispatcher remained calm, but a hint of concern entered their voice. "Understood, 7 Adam 12. Units are being diverted. But Officer Flores, you need to know this. The bridge you're approaching, the old Blackwood Creek Bridge, was structurally compromised and demolished entirely in 1995. There's only a deep ravine at that location." Flores slammed on the brakes. She looked out the windshield. Ahead of her, bathed in her headlights, was the old Blackwood Creek Bridge. It was undeniably there, a massive, rusted steel truss bridge, a relic of the 1940s, spanning a deep, terrifying gorge below. It should not exist. The logbook was not directing her to a location in the present. It was directing her to the location as it existed in 1948. The radio crackled violently, and the dispatcher's voice was violently cut off, replaced by the deep, hollow chuckle from the back seat. "You can't call for backup, 7 Adam 12. This shift is solitary. It always has been." The canvas blanket was now visibly struggling. The sound of heavy metal chains rattling furiously against the seat began to fill the car. Flores reached for the heavy iron key that Miles had used in the sanatorium. She needed to break the cycle. She grabbed the logbook, flipped past the new entry, and looked at the next blank page, the one designated for permanent resolution. She realized destroying the book was impossible, but she could file a final, authoritative report that the system had to accept. She jammed the key into the plastic cover of the logbook, gouging a deep, deliberate line across the cover, destroying the material. She then frantically began to write on the final page, using her pen to reinforce the intentional damage. Final resolution: permanent termination of patrol 1948. Disposition: all evidence, Hale and logbook, secured and permanently decommissioned via final command. Destroy all. She stopped writing. The chains in the back seat stopped rattling down a cold, heavy silence fell over the cruiser. The car's engine was the only sound. Flores reached for the radio and keyed the mic. Dispatch 7 Adam 12. Disregard all previous distress calls. Situation is code 4 secure. No further assistance required. The dispatcher, sounding confused, responded. Copy 7 Adam 12. Are you certain? Affirmative, Flores said, her voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. The evidence is being decommissioned. She put the car into drive and slowly drove onto the Phantom Bridge. The metal groaned beneath the tires, a deep, mournful sound. She was moments away from the center point, mile marker 31. She had one last action to take. Flores is now committed to the final act of destruction. Flores drove the patrol car slowly onto the crumbling, spectral surface of the old Blackwood Creek Bridge. Below her, the gorge was a sheer drop into absolute darkness, where the swift current of the river rushed unseen. The bridge groaned, a sound like a tortured metal beast. She reached the center point, mile marker 31. The car shuddered to a halt. She looked at the logbook, now resting on the passenger seat. Her final resolution, which commanded the destruction of the patrol, was still being rejected, its lines flickering faintly. The system was waiting for the final, physical act of disposition. She looked in the rearview mirror. The dark canvas covering Officer Hale's temporary holding unit was violently thrashing. The sound of the chains was deafening. The guttural snarls of the entity barely contained. Flores unbuckled her seatbelt. Her heart was a cold stone, but her mind was clear. She wasn't just following the log. She was rewriting the final report with action. She grabbed the large, tarnished iron key, the key that opened the lockbox and was now gouged into the logbook's cover. Your patrol ends here, Hale, she whispered. She exited the car, her feet hitting the cracked asphalt of the Phantom Bridge. The air was frigid and heavy with the scent of ozone and the decaying metal of the 1940s. She opened the driver's side rear door. The canvas blanket was tearing, and a long, skeletal hand, encased in a fraying black glove, shot out, grasping for her arm. Flores didn't flinch. She slammed the key, the heavy, iron key, down with all her strength onto the door frame. The metal groaned in protest. You filed your disappearance as a duty call, Flores yelled into the night, her voice ringing with desperate authority. You made a false police report. Your final assignment is permanent decommissioning. She reached into the vehicle, ignoring the clawing hand, and gripped the logbook. She tore off the last page, the one with her rejected resolution, and threw it into the gorge. She then looked at the heavy canvas blanket and the struggling figure beneath it. Hale wasn't just a ghost. He was a self-perpetuating corruption of duty, a paradox of a perpetrator assigned to his own missing persons case. Flores took one final look at the struggling black mass, then stepped back, drew her sidearm, and aimed at the front passenger side window. She fired 4 rapid shots, shattering the glass. The air immediately rushed through the cruiser. The shrieking of the antique siren began its final, prolonged wail, not just from the back seat, but from every speaker, every piece of metal in the car. It was the sound of the system violently overloading. Flores slammed the barrel of her empty sidearm against the shifter, forcing the gear into neutral. She then shoved the heavy, iron logbook back onto the driver's seat. The book had to go down with the assignment. With a final push, she launched the patrol car forward. The cruiser rolled silently, gathering speed, its shattered windows screaming with the final, terrible blast of the antique siren. That IT hit the end of the spectral bridge with a deafening screech of tortured metal, its headlights momentarily illuminating the dark chasm before it plunged into the abyss. The last thing Flores saw before the vehicle hit the water was a burst of sickly green light from the back seat, followed by a final, horrifying crash as the metal hit the Blackwood Creek 60 feet below. The light and the sound vanished instantly. The bridge, the gorge, and the crushing cold all dissolved. Flores blinked. She was standing on the side of a modern, well-paved two-lane road. There was no gorge, no bridge, only a shallow, narrow stream. The patrol car was gone. The air was clean. The night was silent.